So, just to fill you guys in, our poetry group meets once a month mostly. And for the last couple of years, our topic of study has been, we found this book in the library called the Poets Laureate Anthology. And we have been going through all the poets laureate of the United States, starting when it first started back in the 1930s up to the present. And taking a look each month at that person and reading some of their works and just figuring out how they fit into the American scheme, I guess. Because some of them were early poets that, like, have you heard of this guy? He was a poet laureate, so like, how come we didn't study him in school? And others, of course, everyone knows. And Gwendolyn Brooks is one of those. It's a name that even if you don't know who she is, you know you've heard that name before. And Gwendolyn Brooks was appointed to actually at that point. The official title is Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress, and that's how the title was from the beginning up until during Gwendolyn Brooks's term, and then they put the word laureate in there. So she is the last consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress. She also was the first African-American woman to hold the post. She had a lot of firsts, actually. And I was just thinking to myself that since this was Black History Month last month in February, probably all across the country, there's probably thousands of school kids wrote reports on Gwendolyn Brooks last month. So if we could just gather all those up, I wouldn't have to do this at all because all that information would be there. But anyway, Gwendolyn Brooks was born in 1917 in Topeka, Kansas, but when she was 6 weeks old, you're gonna come running down here? When she was 6 weeks old, her family moved to Chicago, and that's where she lived for most of the rest of her life. She had a few sojourns, obviously, to Washington for the Poets Laureate position, and then to some other places, but she spent most of her time in Chicago. She published her first poem in a children's magazine at the age of 13, and by the time she was 16, she had compiled a portfolio of about 75 published poems. And at 17, she started submitting her work to the poetry column of the Chicago Defender, which was an African-American newspaper in Chicago at the time. And after graduating from junior college in 1956, she worked as a director of publicity for a youth organization that was associated with the NAACP. Meanwhile, she was participating in poetry readings and workshops at Chicago's Southside Community Arts Center, and writing poems, and her first published work was called A Street in Bronzeville, which was sort of the name she gave to her Southside Chicago neighborhood. It was published in 1945, and it got instant critical acclaim. She received her first Guggenheim Fellowship and was included as one of the 10 Young Women of the Year by Mademoiselle magazine. What an honor. But her second collection was titled Annie Allen, and it was released in 1949. And in 1950, she got the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for this work. And she was the first African-American to be granted a Pulitzer Prize at all. And she was up against some stiff competition that year. It was Robert Frost and William Carlos Williams were also up for consideration. And I want to take a minute to read a letter from a member of the prize committee. The Pulitzer Prize committee that year consisted of three men. There was Henry Canby, Alfred Kramborg, and Louis Untermeyer. And for anybody who's been following along, Louis Untermeyer was our consultant in poetry in 1961, but at the time of this, which was 1950, he wasn't there yet, but he will be one day. But anyway, so Mr. Canby wrote a letter to someone else explaining, their choice. And he says, I have the honor to submit herewith the recommendation of the advisory committee for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry this year. The finest book of poetry this year is very naturally the complete poems of Robert Frost, which summarizes his whole career. For various good reasons, the committee feels it would be most unwise to give the award to this book unless no other worthy candidate was in sight. And I quote the statement of Mr. Untermeyer, for which I entirely agree. If the judges were to award the prize literally to the best book of the year, the prize would have to be given to the complete poems of Robert Frost. As the title indicates, this is the cumulative work of the greatest living American poet, possibly the greatest poet living today, but, and it is important but, Frost has received the award 4 times already, and with the exception of a few added titles, these are all the same poems. A further honor to Frost would not only be superfluous, but be so repetitious as to seem silly. In addition, an award to Frost would be a confession that current poetry is so lifeless that we have to turn again to the one poet that we can cite as a contemporary tradition. So they ruled Frost out. And then Canby continues in this letter, there is another important contribution to poetry this year which also deserves a special statement. Mr. William Carlos Williams has been steadily growing in stature and published in 1949 a book of selected poems and the first 3 sections of his long poem called Patterson. There is every reason to believe that his new selected poems, to be published in 1950, will be much more representative of what he can do. Also, it is at least possible that the 4th section of his Patterson, also to be published this year, may throw some light, at present absent, on the significance of the whole. We do not feel inclined to recommend him for a Pulitzer Prize this year. We believe that next year it will be possible to form a much sounder judgment, either positive or negative. I wonder if William Carlos Williams ever saw this letter, but just an aside here, that William Carlos Williams had actually been offered the consultancy in poetry the year before this, in 1948, but he couldn't accept it because of some health issues. And he got offered it again in 1952, but he never really actually ended up serving because of ill health, and then some McCarthyism issues got pushed in there. So one wonders if he had been the consultant in poetry that previous year when this committee was meeting, if they would have changed their minds about whether to give him the Pulitzer or not. But he did eventually get a Pulitzer in 1963, which is posthumously awarded because he died the year before, for his work Pictures from Bruegel and Other Poems. Anyway, end of the aside there. Canby continues in his letter, fortunately, among the other books of poems submitted for an award is a volume of great originality, real distinction, and high value as a book, as well as poetry. I quote from Mr. Alfred Krainborg, whose opinion I entirely agree. A few years ago, Gwendolyn Brooks, the young Chicago poet, made her debut in book form with A Street in Bronzeville, a small Spoon River anthology of the Negro. This was followed last year by Annie Allen, an even finer volume which introduces further characters out of her South Side background, with Annie herself as the central figure with her peregrinations from childhood through girlhood to womanhood. These notes, as the author modestly calls her varied lyrics and ballads, are finally developed in a single short narrative, the Aeneid, whose title deftly parodies the Aeneid, and whose intellectual sweep over common experience is not only brilliant, but profound in its tragic and tragicomic implications. The book as a whole gives the evidence that the poet firmly resisted temptations of special pleading, the bane of most social verse of our time. Her work is truly objective, never propagandistic, and above all, originally. And Canby continues, Gwendolyn Brooks has twice received Guggenheim Fellowships and a grant from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In recommending that she receive the 1949 Award for Poetry from the Pulitzer Committee, for which the judges voted unanimously, they feel that a wider public will be drawn toward an artist of outstanding merit. I may say that we have seldom been more satisfied with our choice of Annie Allen. And I will stop to think about this for a minute. This is 1950, and this committee, which is 3 old white guys, are selecting as their prize-winning person, a 32-year-old black woman who only has a junior college education. She's not in the in crowd with poetry. A lot of the poets who've said so far have much more higher academic degrees, working in academia, and they all kind of seem to know each other. And she's at this point still sort of an outsider. So I just thought that was sort of outstanding that in 1950, they made this choice just for someone that relatively young and that unestablished in the poetry world. But anyway, the honors kept pouring in for her. She got a lot of other firsts, and she was in 1968, she was appointed the Poet Laureate of Illinois. In 76, she was the first African-American woman inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And of course, she became the 29th consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress in 1985. She has more than 75 honorary degrees from colleges and universities worldwide, and there are many Gwendolyn Brooks chairs in various universities now, and Gwendolyn Brooks centers at universities, and there's schools and libraries named after her all over the place. She was even on a postage stamp in 2012. So, and anyway, she died at age 83 at the end of 2000 and still living in Chicago at that time. Anyway, I'm going to read two short poems of hers. This first one is called We Real Cool. And this, if you pick up any anthology, this poem's going to be in it. I guess it's one of her most famous ones, or one that she's known for. It's quite short, but it's called The Pool Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, we thin gin, we jazz June, we die soon. So, just a statement. And this one I like, it's called The Crazy Woman. I shall not sing a May song. A May song should be gay. I'll wait until November and sing a song of gray. I'll wait until November, that is the time for me. I'll go out in the frosty dark and sing most terribly. And all the little people will stare at me and say, that is the crazy woman who would not sing in May.